On this video, we're going to talk about song forms and the different types, different terminology. So I've mentioned the fact that song forms are simple forms. So these terms are synonymous. So you can look just in general at forms as either being simple forms or compound forms, which are combinations of two or more simple forms. So I already talked about this. So for instance, if you just had a little folk song, and it was a single phrase in length, then that would be called a one-part song form. And so you talk about essential members, which are the principal parts. So we're going to see that we have one-part song forms, we have two-part song forms, we have extended two-part song forms, and then three-part song forms, enlarged three-part song forms, and incipient three-part song forms, and five-part song forms. So they're all described by the number of parts that they have. And so the number of parts then, in addition to the use of optional parts, which are called auxiliary members, that's the main terminology that you use in talking about these. So, auxiliary members are optional. Included in these are introduction, and then transitions, and retransition, very similar to the transition, just takes you back to something you've heard before. And then codetta, or coda, which is a longer version, so codetta is shorter. And then we're going to talk about one term too that's discussed in this section, disillusion, which is a term that has to do with the phrase extension technique. So we'll get to all that here in just a minute. But at any rate, these are all optional and are used within the context then of these different song form situations. So what I want to do first now is to talk about these different auxiliary members. So with an introduction, you basically have two types of introductions. You have a simple introduction, which is something that is shorter. And it basically will just either establish an accompaniment pattern or the tonality, the key of the work. So you might have a Chopin nocturne that starts out just two measures and it's just arpeggiating a harmony, just to set the mood and set the particular key of that. And then the melody itself, the first part of that, then begins in the third measure. So So the other type of introduction is an independent introduction, which is longer, which has its own melody, usually. And which typically is terminated by a cadence. So the simple introduction probably won't cadence. It's just going to present just a pattern, accompaniment pattern, and then the melody begins. This independent introduction is going to have more of a contrasting element to it and is more self-contained in that sense. So often these independent introductions form a sense of contrast. So an example would be, like the introduction to the Mozart Prague Symphony, first movement, or Haydn London Symphony. Those works had adagio introductions, and so there was a contrast of tempo and also then the contrast of mode, usually key. So a lot of times they'll be in the opposite mode. So in both of those examples, you had independent introductions that were in focusing on D minor, and then when the movement exposition began, tempo changes to allegro, and then at that point changes to D major. And so you have that contrast of tempo and mode. Put your key. All right, so we'll use those two terms to describe introductions. All right, a transition is a connecting passage and often it modulates, so it links and modulates. And so you'll find transitions between parts in a song form. You'll use the same term, within the context of rondo or sonata allegro or minuet trio, these compound forms. So we'll continue using these basic auxiliary terms. And the only difference between a transition and a retransition is that the retransition links to returning material. So connects or links. All right, so you'll find these types of auxiliary members in places where, like in a three-part song form, we're going to see that three-part song forms bring back in the third part the material from the first part. So parts 1 and parts 3 have to do with bringing back, returning that material. And so at the end of part 2, then you could have a retransition, then that's a linking, returning passage that then connects to part 3. You find them in sonata allegro form at the places at the very end of the development section where it returns the opening theme, the opening A theme. That's then where you have the recapitulation. So a retransition at that point, and then also there's a retransition connecting the return of the A theme to the return of the B theme. So we'll be using that term. So a coda is something that is a concluding passage, as you know already. And it's something which in a Mozart or Haydn work would give a sense of closure and wouldn't be particularly long and would just very often present 5/1 cadences. In Beethoven, we're going to see that Beethoven writes longer coda sections, and very often he'll even extend it to the length of a second development section. He'll continue to develop his themes, modulate through some more keys and discuss his thematic idea more. So, there's no definition as far as the difference between a coda and codetta other than the length. So we'll just put here used. So a longer So that really is the only difference. It's just a codetta is shorter than a coda. All right, so those are the main auxiliary members. And then we'll use this term disillusion. Which is something which is, the term dissolution means it's something coming apart. This in music denotes an extension device so it's a way of extending the length of a phrase. So you have a 4-measure phrase, but then in the 5th measure, it's extending that 4-measure idea by repeating the material from the end of the phrase. So it could either, repeat literally, or it could sequence. But somehow or another, it's going to take the end of the phrase, that 4th measure, and then continue to sequence or repeat that to extend it. And so in general, it doesn't go more than, like 3 measures or so. Maybe it could have, an extra 4 measures of disillusion, but usually that's going to get into the area of being another phrase in itself. So anyway, typical situation is like 5 or 6 measures in length, and you look at the end of that irregular length phrase and see if it gets, the extension part occurs at the end by repeating the end of the 4-measure idea. Okay, so we'll see this in some different contexts, different examples of that. All right. Now, what I'd like for you to do is to go to the website and to click on the tab on the home page that says Handouts and Scores, and then slide down to Song Forms, and then slide across to the right to Song Form Handout. So if you'll pull that up right now, I'm going to talk about these different types of song forms. So the first type is a 1-part song form, which the basic idea with one-part song forms is that there's not a sense of contrast that's inherent in the form. So it includes, it can be as short as a single phrase. So that was the first thing that I wrote up, that if you just have a single four-measure phrase, that would be an example of a one-part song form, and the phrase construction would be single phrase. All right, so short is a phrase in length, but it also includes parallel periods, so that would be A prime. Parallel double periods. Now, in a parallel double period, you can have a contrasting phrase, but you have that, you know, like A prime, A double prime, A triple prime, or A, you could have a B and then A prime, C, something like that would be an example of a parallel double period. But anyway, that's a situation where you could have a contrasting phrase, but that first and third phrase would have to be parallel in order to call this a one-part song form. So it includes parallel double periods. Also, we'll use one-part song form to include modified parallel periods. And if you have a phrase group that all three phrases are parallel, we will call that a one-part song form as well. And so I just state there the basic factor in determining the difference between one and two-part song forms is that one-part song forms are comprised of some type of parallel construction. All right, so if you will now, you might need to open up another tab if you don't want to go back and forth, but we're going to go to listening examples. And if you will slide down to song forms and click on song forms, then I'm going to play this first example, which is one of the Chopin Preludes. It's the shortest, actually, of the Chopin Preludes. It's the one that is in A major. And you can also then pull up a score for that if you have two tabs opened up. And so that is going to be also on this song form tab underneath handouts and scores. So if you go to handouts and scores, slide down to song form, and then slide across, you'll have song form handout, but then the second one beneath that is song form examples. So if you'll click on that, and then open that up, then you'll see these examples of song forms here. And so the first one is an example, like I just mentioned, where it is a single phrase in length. You have the first two, example A, example B, are both single phrases. So those are examples of one-part song form. Number two I have there is a parallel period, A prime. That was one of the homework. That was the first one that you looked at. So that was a parallel period, so example of a one-part song form. And then number three is the one that I was talking about, which is the shortest Chopin Prelude. And so let's click on this recording by Archer Rubinstein, and I'll just kind of talk over this and stop along the way. And so what you're going to hear, if you look at the score, is that this is in four-measure phrases. And so this is slurred in two-measure semiphrases. But you're going to hear that all four of these phrases are basically parallel in construction. And so let's listen to this. Second phrase. So here's the key phrase. This is parallel to the first phrase. Therefore, it's a parallel double period.